Hello, Witch Mob. Welcome to episode 3 of the Who Is This Crazy Hag podcast. Just like all the time, we've got chickens and roosters and dogs barking and babies crying and transport, and I think there's a chicken laying an egg right behind us. There's no fancy studio here, I can assure you. Anyway, so who am I? We could start right back at the beginning and say I was born in Tasmania, aka Lutruwita, the Palawa name for our native land. You could also say I'm a Tasmanian devil who got off the island. I was an avid reader as a child, immersed in books far beyond my age. My mother had an extensive bookshelf and I devoured pretty much everything on it by the time I was 15. Reading about the vast planet out there to explore inside the covers of those books inspired me to dream of travelling, and then I made my dreams come true. For this story, we're travelling to India, so get yourself some comfort food and snuggle up, because this one's going to be interesting. Before we get started, I want to say a big hello to Kerry, Lisa and Janice in Australia, Melanie in Belgium, Wendy in Canada, Nina and Funny in Germany, Sophia in Ecuador, Angie in the USA, and Rosa in the UK. Thanks for listening, guys. If your ideal vacation includes lounging in hammocks and reading books, Secret Garden could be the perfect spot for you. From observing iguanas to watching hummingbirds, picking fresh tropical fruit from the garden, and walking to the beach, you can do as little or as much as you like. Secret Garden is an eco-house where you can get away from it all and truly relax. Make your booking on Instagram or Facebook at Secret Garden Mompiche. The links are in the show notes. Use the code WITCHPOD for a 20% discount on a 6-day stay. This story is called Are You Sure It's Just a Cold? This story took place in India in 1990, so that's 34 years ago. It was a dark and stormy night. Just kidding. Actually, it was our third night on Nagoa Beach. And man, what a crazy night it was. Steam rising from the damp forest floor left our burning skins slick with a sticky film of perspiration. We lay tossing and turning in our beds until dawn. Threadbare cotton sheets clung to our sweating bodies like lengths of crinkled plastic wrap. Perspiration drips trickled as they ran from our underarms into the bed. Sweat stains spread out on the bedding. Ceiling fans languidly chased fetid hot air around our stuffy room in endless circles. The coolest thing in the village was the hotel manager's fake designer sunglasses. The third sultry night was no different to the previous two, and yet, somehow, it was. But I digress. Let's go back to the beginning of the story. Nagoa Beach is 2 kilometres of horseshoe-shaped white sand situated on the tiny island of Diu in the Saurashtra coast of Gujarat. Diu is in the Gulf of Khambhat, or the Gulf of Cambay, on the Arabian Sea. The Chassi River runs right through the middle of the island, which is about 20 kilometres in circumference. A Portuguese colony from 1534 to 1961, Diu served the conquerors as a strategically located naval base. Nowadays, the main activity of the locals is fishing. 10 days previously, while we were exploring Udaipur in Rajasthan, another traveller had described Nagoa as an exquisitely beautiful getaway with gorgeous sandy beaches, dense palm groves, and countless historical monuments. In the early 1990s, Diu was trying to establish itself as one of India's undiscovered jewels. Janine and I had spent our third day in the area exploring the massive Portuguese-built fortress, which dominates the skyline at Dewtown. Surrounded by sea on three sides, the impressive fort is the only remaining legacy of the violent struggles that took place between Bahadur Shah, the Sultan of Gujarat, Humayun, the Mughal emperor, and the Portuguese. My travelling companion and I had also visited the Gangeshwar temple in Fudam village, located about 3 kilometres from the town, as well as the Jalandhar shrine, the Navlakha Parshvanath temple, Jama Masjid, and the fascinating Dew Museum, filled to bursting with artefacts, antique statues, the stone inscriptions of the region's earlier rulers, intricate wooden carvings, and several idol shadow clocks. St. Paul's Church, adorned with shell-like motifs, was another visit-worthy Portuguese landmark in Dew. After satisfying both our curiosity for all things historical and our craving to learn all we could about Indian culture, we ate a hearty vegetarian lunch at a local stall in the marketplace and returned to our digs on the beach near the hamlet of Birchawada. The dilapidated open-air bus jolted along on a bumpy potholed semi-existent track through open arid land towards the dense coconut groves surrounding the beach. On the hard seats, we bounced around inside the jalopy, our heads like a pair of those wobbly-headed dogs you see in the back windows of cars. "Now I know how popcorn feels," I muttered as my aching buttocks tangoed wildly with the worn vinyl bench. When the road got really bad, we had to hang on to the seats in front of us with one hand and put the other hand above our heads to avoid cracking our skulls on the roof or being flung out the windows. Passing cars generated clouds of red dust that settled in layers on our moist skin, making us look like sandstone statues. Alongside the gravel road, hoka trees whispered and swayed in the breeze. When we first heard about it, Janine and I were drawn to the peaceful serenity at Nagoa, in contrast to the mayhem of Udaipur. Despite being thoroughly misled, we decided to stay one extra day. "What do you think?" asked Janine, glancing sideways at me after she suggested staying an extra day. "I don't have any urgent appointments," I replied glibly, shrugging. After buzzing around like a bluebottle fly to take in the sights on previous days, I planned to spend the extra day doing nothing. To make destiny laugh, one should always make plans. According to the travel brochure, Nagoa Beach was a gorgeous, crescent-shaped strip of sand enclosing a cove of crystal blue water, the perfect spot to swim, wade in the shallows, sunbathe on pure sun-kissed sands, and relax by refreshingly clear sea. In reality, the long beach at Nagoa was thickly littered with rubbish and human excrement. Murky brown water, similar in colour and temperature to 3-week-old onion soup, lapped hungrily at the filthy sand. The sole source of accommodation was a dirty, overpriced hotel surrounded by a 2-metre-high security fence topped with electrified razor wire. The only restaurant in town was at the hotel. They served expensive, mediocre meals. The single honest sentence in the entire Nagoa brochure was the one describing the shape of the beach. It did indeed curve around like a long horseshoe. Stern-faced police carrying long black batons constantly patrolled the beach area outside the hotel, savagely beating crowds of staring local men away from disgruntled female tourists who sunbathed clad only in barely visible string bikinis. Their boyfriends fumed at the constant intrusion. It wasn't that these men actually did anything. They just stood in clusters and stared. It was awful. "Get away from here, you creeps," yelled the women, waving clenched fists at their nemesis. The women found the stares uncomfortable and intimidating. Some threw small stones randomly into the crowd. "Bugger off," warned the boyfriends. "Go away and leave us alone. This is our beach. You go home. Don't come here if you don't like it," retorted the men, lasciviously ogling exposed tracts of bare, tanned female flesh that spread along the beach. A few larger rocks came hurtling back toward the fence into the middle of the tourists. "Get back," shouted the police, threatening the goggle-eyed Indian men by waving their sticks and connecting with whatever skull or shoulder blade that was in the way. Inside the safety of the prison-like fence, we did our best to pretend the nightmare outside wasn't taking place. To distract ourselves, Janine and I sipped chilled coconut water from freshly picked green coconuts, chewed on pumpkin seeds, and watched the sun slip under the horizon, heralding the end of another day in paradise. Resolute, we kept our clothes on. Nights on Nagoa were usually quiet. The throng of idle perverts went home to their wives, kids, parents, and a bowl of hot curry and rice in the early evenings. Around the same time, the women on the beach began to cover themselves with brightly tie-dyed sarongs. Back then, Nagoa Beach wasn't a known tourist mecca, and there were no bars, restaurants, or nightclubs to enjoy in the evenings. We made our own fun and played cards or backgammon. Someone usually strummed a guitar by a bonfire on the beach. Everyone sang along if they knew the song, even those who couldn't hold a note still caterwauled with the best of them. That third night was rough. Sleep eluded me. Tossing and turning in twisted sheets, I performed a strenuous workout of nocturnal aerobics until the sun peeked over the horizon. Sweating and aching, I couldn't get comfortable on the hard mattress. Alternately listening to the sea lapping at the beach and the wind rustle through the palm trees, I couldn't shut my eyes. When I did, they would snap open as each sound seemed amplified to eardrum-bursting volumes. Just before dawn, a group of local men were huddled outside the hotel, letting off firecrackers. After 3 days of non-stop harassment, which had taken a great toll on my psyche, I'd had my fill of Nagoa and Nagoan men. In a raging fury, I stormed out of the hotel security gate to throw coconuts at the dawn raiders. "Get out of here," I screamed, pitching several dried brown coconuts like shot puts in the direction of the offenders. Realizing I was serious and not far from my mark, they ran away laughing. Exhausted from the effort, I went inside and climbed back into my crumpled and sweaty sheets. My head pounded. Every muscle in my body ached. As the sun rose over our little beach resort, sleep finally overtook me. I woke a couple of hours later feeling lethargic, my eyes like pinheads. The day passed agonizingly slowly. Unable to focus on reading my book or writing my journal, I lounged in the shade on the front steps of the hotel. Each time I slapped at a mosquito, an army of black ants marched up the concrete stairs and carried the squished little carcass away. Within minutes, the steps were deserted as if they'd never been there. Fascinated by this little ritual, and disinclined to do anything else, I spent the mornings slapping at mosquitoes. By midday, the ants had come and gone at least 24 times. A short while later, as I lay on a hammock to try and read my book, yet another dramatic scene unfolded on the crowded beach. Some angry tourists had begun another fight with the unwelcome crowd of loitering men. Tensions reached boiling point. Punches were thrown. A brawl broke out. The police arrived in a shouting mob and struggled to tear the antagonists apart. Soon, confused police waved batons in the air and took random hits at anything that got in their way. Battered and bruised, the irate tourists quickly backed off and huddled in a small group at the front of the security gate. The idle mob of locals was dispersed and eventually the beach was cleared. 2 policemen stayed nearby to make sure none of them returned. "Serene?" I asked Janine, who was journaling at a table nearby. "I don't think so." "Yeah," she agreed. "It's time to head somewhere fun." We hitched a ride to the bus station with a local family and boarded the next bus to Junagadh. The air was thick with stifling heat. It was so hot, I felt as if I were being cooked alive. It was raining in some areas and, at times, the bus slowed to a crawl along the badly maintained road. Visibility decreased as rain pelted down in torrents. The bus slowed to walking pace. The stale air inside the vehicle became so humid I felt faint and nauseous. We rambled through small towns and farming villages for a couple of hours. "Is it just me, or is it really hot in here?" I asked Janine. "Oh, it's hot in here," she replied, clinging to the rail above her head as the bus rocked and rolled along the track. I remember little else of the bus ride, except that it was jam-packed. People were crammed into every available space like human sardines. We rubbed up against each other, sweaty skin and reeking breath, mingling with rancid air. I felt hot and dizzy for most of the trip. Sitting on top of my bag on the floor in the center aisle, I leaned back against a seat and wished for sleep to come and take me away. When we finally arrived at Junagadh bus station, Janine and I shouldered our heavy backpacks and trudged to a hotel about 1 kilometer away. We found a suitable room and checked in immediately. I remember nothing of the 20-minute walk to the hotel or even checking in. The room spun around and I collapsed onto the hard bed. Sinking into a deep sleep, I welcomed the much-needed rest. Waking a few hours later, I felt a little better. Janine came in from her explorations to see how I was doing before heading off to find food. The whole day had vanished, sucked into a vortex of delicious oblivion. I barely managed to swallow a few spoons of plain rice before slipping back into a dreamless sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up needing the toilet. Getting out of bed, I stood up and took a few steps towards the bathroom. The next thing I knew, Janine was picking me up off the floor. "Oops, ups-a-daisy, here we go," she crooned, half carrying me across the room. She helped me get back into bed and pulled the covers up to my chin. "Are you okay? Here, have some water." I had passed out, knocking my head on the small cupboard beside my bed. The next morning, Janine called a doctor. The whites of my eyes and skin had turned a sickly yellow color. I was vomiting, had a burning fever, and suffered intense muscle pain. My head pounded and the thudding ache in my lower back was agonizing. Moving from one side to the other to get comfortable in bed had become a painful exercise. My hips felt as if they were strapped to a medieval torture rack. The doctor barely looked at me. He stuck a thermometer in my mouth and put his hand on my pulse. He listened to my heart and looked into my eyes and down my throat. "She has a cold," he told Janine. "Are you sure it's just a cold?" she asked. Nodding silently, he prescribed a list of medications as long as my arm and went away grumbling at being called out for a cold. "Rubbish," I said when he left. It wasn't a cold, and I knew it. After flicking through the pages in Janine's book of international travel sicknesses, I wondered if it could be hepatitis A. I had almost all of the symptoms described in that section. Janine was sure the doctor was wrong too, but she wasn't at all certain what the strange illness was. Contracting hepatitis A seemed a little dramatic. She thought it must be something else. I wasn't sure either. The list of symptoms had been close, but I couldn't get out of bed to do anything about it. Janine purchased the prescribed medicine from a nearby pharmacy, and I stayed in bed for 5 days, while I shuddered and sweated through the long hot days, flying on the wings of delusion through some of the weirdest dreams I've ever had. Janine explored Junagadh. Each morning before she went out, my companion left several bottles of water beside my bed and made sure all the medication was within reach. I wasn't capable of eating anything, but she left some fruit near the bed just in case I got hungry. Then she grabbed her backpack and headed out to see the sights. It's a lovely place, she enthused when she returned from her excursions. There are so many beautiful buildings and wonderful things to see. I wish you'd get better and come out with me. Each evening, Janine regaled me with tales of the fascinating history of the area, sometimes reading it straight from a book she found at reception. And then she explained in vivid detail what she had seen each day. I heard all about her visits to Ashoka's Adix, the Darbar Hall Museum, the Upakot Fort, the Sakabag Museum and Sakabag Zoo, and the shrine of Narsi Mehta, none of which I could recall with any clarity later on. Surrounded by rolling hills, Junagadh derives its name from an old fortress. At the time, it was a sacred place of pilgrimage for Hindus, as well as a nature reserve for various flora and fauna. In those days, the area around Junagadh was also known as one of the few places left in India where lions still roamed free. Janine strode around the city day after day, visiting the sights. As the days rolled on, and my condition didn't improve, she ventured further out and travelled to the Wellington Dam, Mahabat Maqbara, Damodar Kund, and the Girnar Hills and temples. One steamy morning, Janine climbed nearly 2,000 steps to explore the magnificent Jain temples located about 600 meters above sea level. By day 7, my friend had seen all there was to see and was ready to leave Junagadh. I was ready to leave too, but could barely sit up in bed without suffering a nasty head spin. Go, continue your travels, I told her. I'll be fine in a few days. She ignored me and stayed. We were both bored with the situation. 1 week had passed, and the most I had seen of Junagadh was 4 blue walls, a white ceiling, and whatever fluorescent hallucinations danced around the room. The hotel owner, a nice old man in a white dhoti, carrying an ornately carved wooden walking cane, stopped by my room twice a day to see how I was progressing. He brought buckets of boiled water and bowls piled high with plain steamed rice that I couldn't eat. The mere thought of food made me feel nauseous. Please, he begged me one afternoon, his turbaned head jaggling from side to side. You must not die in my hotel. It is bad karma. I shuddered and shivered through long sleepless nights, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the city, at times distorted by fever into the howls of demons. Drifting in and out of sleep by day, time crawled slowly by. Strange figures whirled and twirled in front of my eyes. Creatures came out of the walls. The floor rose to meet the ceiling. The sweat-soaked bedsheets tried to strangle me. I kicked them away in a blind panic and threw them on the floor. Ah, I screamed when the walls crawled in. No, I groaned when the pounding in my head threatened to kill me. By day 10, I became delirious and had stopped sweating. Sipping several liters of water every day had no effect. My body sucked in fluids faster than I could drink. Around lunchtime, I broke out in a hot, dry fever that lasted several hours. Janine had just returned from a day trip to Chorwad, about 65 kilometers southwest, when she noticed my skin was dry. Alarmed by this unexpected regression, She soaked the towels in cold water and laid them over my burning body. A German woman, Anya, wrapped cool wet towels around my feet. Someone else pressed a cool towel to my forehead. "This is not good," they said. "She's gravely ill." 7 people stood around my bed with concerned frowns. They hovered over me, muttering to each other in subdued tones. I opened my eyes and tried to focus on the blurry sea of worried faces. "Are we having a party? Are there any beers?" I asked, smiling cheekily at them through the pounding in my head. No one thought I was funny. "It's possible you have malaria," Anya's husband suggested. Another doctor was called immediately. Within half an hour, Dr. Nanavati had taken blood and urine samples. "She needs to drink a lot of water. You should also continue keeping her cool with wet towels," he told everyone standing around the bed. "We must try to break the fever." As he left, he promised the results of the lab tests would be available in 2 days. He would be back then. The room full of strangers took turns through the night keeping an eye on me. Janine stayed by my bedside for 2 full days. She trickled water into my mouth, wiped the sweat off my face, covered me in wet towels, gave me cool sponge baths, and tried to get me to eat. I still couldn't face food. Swinging between moments of lucidity and hours of delirium, the illness consumed my body. Sometime during the second night of their vigil, I slipped into unconsciousness. The room at the Nanavati Hospital in Junagadh was basic, with an old-style hospital bed, a bedpan, and a plastic chair. The walls were white, dulled by years of use. I was put into a private room and assigned 2 or 3 duty nurses who diligently watched over me 24 hours a day. Now there were professionals to take care of me. Janine took a well-earned break and went on a day trip to mythical Sasangir, about 60 kilometers southeast. She figured I was in good hands and desperately needed some time on her own to relax and de-stress. The pressure of coping with my illness was getting to her. If I'd been awake, I would have insisted she go on that trip to get away. Based on the test results, Dr. Nanavati diagnosed falciparum malaria. There are several strains of malaria. Some are potentially deadly and some are mild but unpleasant, sometimes returning in hot climates. Falciparum malaria is one of those fatal strains that ravage people, making them suffer painfully before taking their lives. Generally, only 10% of its victims survive. The single shred of good news the doctor could offer was that the survivors of this particular deadly strain of malaria rarely ever contracted it again. Quinine, saline, and plasma dripped into my veins as I slept. Dr. Nanavati's nurses were instructed to give me Maladin 3 times a day. The hours ticked away. Nothing changed. My temperature topped 40 Celsius plus. My blood pressure dropped to 60/40. My condition didn't improve. Janine came into the hospital, refreshed and relaxed from her break, to be told I probably wouldn't make it through the night. "I'm sorry. We've done everything that we can. I don't think she'll survive," said Dr. Nanavati. "I'd like to stay with her if that's okay," Janine replied, scared. The medical staff at the hospital were brilliant and immediately rearranged the room so she could stay. They found a spare cot so Janine could sleep in my room. If it happened, she wanted to be there when I died. The responsibility would fall to her to tell my family everything that had happened. Nurses checked in every half hour. My sick body chugged through the night. By morning, I was still alive, but not awake. My condition hadn't changed. Dr. Nanavati told my distraught traveling pal I would most likely pass away sometime during the day. The lethal parasitic protozoans had been in my blood for too long before malaria was properly diagnosed. Another day plodded by. Janine cursed the so-called doctor who misdiagnosed a cold. Dr. Nanavati called a Catholic priest. The terrible news quickly spread through Jonagard that a young Australian girl was hovering at death's door. A long queue of locals traipsed through my hospital room all day to wish Janine and I well. A young man named Himanshu handed my friend a get well card and a bunch of local wildflowers he had picked to give me when I woke. Some of the nuns from a nearby convent brought food and water. Dr. Nanavati could do little else and reassured Janine that it wouldn't be much longer. She and the doctor spoke often. Even if she survives, her brain will be fried, he told her. Few people escape brain damage after such a high fever. He also explained that he was expecting my heart to stop any time. Her decreasing blood pressure can't keep her alive much longer. The odds were against me. A Catholic priest performed the last rites. Had I been conscious, I'd have sent him away. I practiced no religion and didn't believe in heaven or hell. As the robed minister completed the ritual, I was unaware of his presence. 2 long days later, I was still unconscious, but my heart was still beating. Dr. Nanavati came in frequently, expecting to find me dead. Nurses regularly adjusted and changed the drips. The nuns brought more food and stayed to cool my forehead with damp washcloths. Janine's fingernails were down to the quicks. Early the following morning, just before dawn, I opened my eyes. The first thing I noticed was the white walls. What happened to the blue walls? I wondered aloud. In the cool grey hour before sunrise, it was eerily quiet. The small room was dimly lit. I turned my head and saw the silhouette of a lamp on a side table that had been brought in for Janine. Then, gradually able to focus as I looked around, I saw the hospital equipment, the drip and the needles, the medication and the patient chart. Surprised, I sat up quickly. The dizzy spell hit me so hard I almost threw up. Nausea clawed at my stomach. My head whizzed around in circles. Lying back into the pillows, I told myself to take it easy. The room had no windows. A sliver of fluorescent light peeked in from the hallway. I turned my head as far as it would go to take in my surroundings. Finally, I looked down past my feet and saw Janine fast asleep on the narrow cot. Even in sleep, I could see she was stressed. I moved my arms and legs a little. They seemed fine. I rolled my eyes up and down, side to side. They were okay. Moving slowly, I sat up in the bed. My neck was sore. My hips ached. But overall, I didn't feel too bad. A few minutes later, one of the nurses came in to check on me. She had fully expected to find a cooling corpse lying on the bed. The woman was so surprised, she shouted and woke Janine. Bolting upright in the cot, my friend's first thought was that I had died during the night. Sheer terror filled her eyes as she looked across at me. Her expression changed quickly into disbelief, then shock. "Hi," I said and smiled. Janine couldn't believe her eyes. The nurse raced down the hall, calling for the doctor. "Come quickly, come quickly." Arriving in a flurry of clucking nurses and flying papers, Dr. Nanavati was stunned and pleasantly surprised. "Not many of my malaria patients make it through alive," he told me, smiling at the marvel of rare success. As he checked my vital signs, he stated that my recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. There was no permanent damage. I had come through reasonably unscathed. 15 days had passed since I had first become ill. In the small town of Junagadh, good news travelled fast. For the next 2 days, almost the entire town came to visit. Even though I didn't know him, Himanshu returned with a fresh bunch of wildflowers and an ear-to-ear grin, happy that I had survived. The priest came back with his flock of chirruping nuns, and they prayed at my bedside. I was too weak to protest. Although relieved I was okay, Janine said little for the first 2 days. The strain on her had been enormous. She reached a pivotal point where she had made a morbid wish. I wish you would either die right now or wake up right now, but stop hanging in limbo. When I was a bit stronger, the nuns insisted we go to the convent and stay until I was well enough to travel. Religious beliefs aside, it was a quiet place to rest and regain my strength. We were given a huge airy room with large comfortable beds and use of all the facilities. When I looked in the full-length mirror that afternoon, I was shocked by my emaciated reflection. Over the previous 2 weeks, I lost over 15 kilograms. Over the next few days, I began my slow recovery. The happy nuns laughed a lot and talked even more. Despite my initial misgivings, they were great company. "What did you see in Junagadh?" someone asked one night. "The hospital!" somebody shrieked, and they all fell about giggling. As I gained strength, Janine took me to a few of the historical sites nearby. Even though most of them were within walking distance, I went slowly and needed to rest often. For the first week, half an apple made me feel as full as if I'd eaten an entire bucket of fruit. "I can't eat any more," I said, refusing the other half of the apple. "You must eat something," insisted the nuns, offering alternatives. During the rare times I did feel hungry, it took forever to decide what I wanted. Half a plate of anything was more than enough food. It took over 3 months for my body to fully recover. By the time we were ready to leave, we had been in Junagadh almost 3 weeks. Our original plan was to stay 3 days. I never did see much of the city, but what I did see is still with me. The wonderful community who pulled together to take care of me and ultimately save my life. The doctors who worked miracles. The nurses were incredible. The hospital staff were fantastic. The nuns were brilliant. And Janine, who stuck by me through thick and thin, was my tower of strength. She was my guardian angel. Without her, I surely would have died of malaria in Junagadh, Gujarat, India. I'll be eternally grateful to her that I was one of the 10%.
Hey there, love bugs! Welcome to the jungle! I'm Nancy Miarelli, your guide to the ecological and entomological, i.e. bug, wonders of Ecuador. With my master's in entomology and a passion for ecology and conservation, I'm here to take you on an unforgettable adventure through the mega diverse forests and more lush than you may have expected mountainsides of Ecuador. This year, I'm excited to offer 2 unique science-focused tours. Join me for a nature journaling course where we'll sit in the grass, sketch, observe, and reflect on all the creatures and plants that we discovered. Or dive deep into evolutionary theory on my evolution tour, where you'll see what you learned in a book that one time growing on the side of a tree. Ready to embark on a journey of discovery? Visit www.scibugs.info, that is Scibugs, SCIBUGS, to learn more or find me, Scibugs, everywhere on the internet. Let's explore Ecuador and all it has to offer together.
Well, that was a real few story, wasn't it? And I was lucky to survive the experience. I can tell you it wasn't fun. The upside is that I'm immune for life and won't get it again. However, I've also had another strain of malaria, dengue fever twice, and chikungunya. I guess the lesson here for travelers is to protect yourself from mosquitoes with the right clothing, repellents, and mosquito nets in tropical places. Stay safe out there. The Who Is This Crazy Hag podcast is created, written, read, produced, edited, mixed and published by Ronnie. If you'd like to grab a copy of Phew, Ah, Ooh, find the paperback on Amazon or email thewitchpod@gmail.com to get an ebook. Also let us know via email or on Blue Sky at The Witch Pod if you're reading in a book club or a group of friends so we can give you a shout out. Don't forget to tell us where you are in the world. Visit the Who Is This Crazy Hag podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music and Castbox. See you next week. Bring a warm jacket and a big mug of hot chocolate for our journey into the heavens in Turkey.